Last week's episode really put She-Hulk on the upright trajectory as a show. And then there's this episode. Welcome back, MCU fans, and thank you for clicking on my spoiler review for She-Hulk Episode 3. Every single week, we are discussing all the spoilers for every episode of She-Hulk Attorney at Law as they drop on Disney+, so make sure you go watch the episode before this video. But once you do, I need you to start the conversation with your thoughts in the comments below. And this week, we find Jen fully engrossed in the Abomination case, handling Wong as a witness, as this case and her career are dependent on him showing up. And this is supposed to be the A storyline. But then there's something else going on with Dennis and an elf who swindled him and pretended to be Megan Thee Stallion. And if you think Jen's storyline is the A storyline, you're kind of wrong. But before we continue cringing through this Dennis and fake Megan Thee Stallion storyline, I need your thoughts on this week's She-Hulk in the comments below. And if you're enjoying this review, if you're enjoying the weekly She-Hulk coverage, if you love movies and TV, this is the place to be. So consider clicking that subscribe button and you won't miss any future conversations in your favorite movies and TV. This episode is completely overtaken by that B storyline with Dennis and the elf Pug handling this case, proving his mettle as a lawyer, which I think is interesting to develop that character. So I want to talk about first that B storyline, which brings the entire pacing and my entire investment in this show completely to a grinding halt. It's just not funny. It's the same joke throughout the entire episode, that this elf pretended to be Megan Thee Stallion, and Dennis believed she was Megan Thee Stallion with his cocky, brash, misogynistic attitude, and he's just so in over his head, he's just so wrapped up in his own ego that he fell for it. He spent like $250,000 or however much it was, $175,000, something like that, on this elf, believing she was Megan Thee Stallion, because he believed he could pull off Megan Thee Stallion. It's 30 minutes of this joke, only for the punchline in the post-credit scene to be Megan Thee Stallion signing with She-Hulk as her lawyer, and the two twerk. Joke and punchline. They build up to it. You can't argue that this episode completely uses its time to build up to a punchline, but it's a very unfunny one. You have moments where the elf tries to pretend to be someone else, tries to be the judge, tries to be Pug himself, harassing the women in his workplace. And those are amusing moments to prove the point the show is trying to make, in all fairness, but this is very much handled as a gag, as a comedy. The show is a comedy. The show is a legal procedure comedy, and the comedy in this episode is just not funny. Everything with Jen and Abomination and Wong, I love, but it feels like it's background. It feeds into the episodic nature of the show, where last week we set everything up, we established all the characters, we established the world, we established the conflict, and all of that was worth investing in emotionally, and being with Jen throughout her conflict was compelling. This episode puts that conflict in the back burner. It handles it. There's a storyline for Jen in here, thankfully, but what the show focuses on, what this episode prioritizes, I found it to be completely wrong and completely unfunny. It's not amusing whatsoever because it just gets old very quick. As soon as it begins, as soon as you have that first joke of Dennis falling for this elf that pretended to be Megan Thee Stallion, and you believe this elf, blah blah, and that's the rest of the episode. The one thing for me that worked about the storyline with the Asgardian elf was once it blends in with Jan's storyline and she serves as a witness to unmask who Dennis actually is. He's an utter moron. He doesn't realize that he's just not that good. His ego is so massive, he doesn't realize how stupid he actually is and sounds and acts around other people. Which leads into a really funny joke when Dennis gives her an idea and she looks at the camera and says, "This stays between us." That's funny. That's the humor I want in this show. That's clever. Breaking of the fourth wall, the style of the show, all encapsulated in that single moment. Everything else that is on the forefront in this episode really got on my nerves. It wasn't funny. It was honestly cringeworthy. I was wincing at certain moments in this episode. And that's essentially a representation of my issues with this show thus far, where when it wants to be an episodic series, it feels so jarring from the rest of what this show is. It feels like it has an identity crisis. Because on Jen's storyline, it has a continuous story that was established in the previous episode, was developed, and now we're paying it off. Everything with Jen and Wong is wonderful. I love seeing Wong just being in basically every MCU thing that comes out. He has been in everything. He seems to be more on the forefront of MCU, and I love these heightened realities crossing over with Jen just stepping into this world with all these fantastical characters and the heightened reality of the MCU that Wong is a part of, with the magic and the cosmicness and all that. And they start to blend in, and Wong has his other responsibilities as the Sorcerer Supreme. He doesn't really know or care really how the legal procedures work, but he's willing to help Jen out. He's willing to go to bat for her and for Abomination, and the case is resolved. Abomination is rehabilitated. You have that moment where he transforms in his cell and everyone just flips out unnecessarily, I might add. Everything about this storyline works not only on a comedic level, but it is important for the narrative and for the characters. Jen starts to reclaim her good name as a lawyer and her worth, really. Now she's all over the news and she can use that to tell her own story, where last week she felt so powerless as She-Hulk, where everyone is naming her, everyone is trying to tell her story how they see it or how they think it happened. Now it's her chance. Now she is empowered. Not only did she win a case, she can tell her own story. The cameras are on her. Everyone wants to listen to her side of the narrative, which is interesting. The embracing of this new side of her is giving her more opportunities. It's making her grow as a character. And of course, that brings us the biggest Easter egg in this episode. I was so elated to see the Wrecking Crew come to life in the MCU. I love how they're portrayed as this sad, loser, pathetic bunch. Because let's face it, in concept, the Wrecking Crew is a really silly concept, and this show embraces that fully. It's also our first tie and big setup to a bigger mystery that connects to a continuous narrative. That's when this show is working best, and She-Hulk kicks their ass, and they talk about the boss being disappointed. I don't think it's going to be Titania. It could be the leader, but because this episode focused so much on Pug, maybe he is hiding something. Maybe he is the son of Leader himself. I don't know. I would love it to be the leader once more, but it could also be Abomination. We talked about last week how he's clearly, in my opinion at least, playing Jan like a fiddle, playing all these judges and all these lawyers and the law as a fiddle to portray himself as rehabilitated. But I think he wants something. I think he wants that power to stay in Abomination mode, because in the comics, he's always in an Abomination mode. He loves being Abomination. So it could be a bigger connection there. Now that he's out of jail, he set out loose the Wrecking Crew on She-Hulk, which was a really bad idea. She kicks their ass fast, and it's really funny to see how she barely breaks a sweat with them. I love that when one grabs her, she's like, oh my god, and then quickly remembers she is She-Hulk. She's still taking those first steps into recognizing that side of herself. Overall, this is easily the weakest episode of She-Hulk thus far for me. Everything that is on the back burner works. Jen's development as a character, her encounter with the Wrecking Crew, Wong's involvement on this is utterly amusing and delightful. I love how nonchalant he is about everything, that he really doesn't understand how this world works. Everything else that this episode actually focuses on represents all my issues with this series. The episodic nature of it, contrasting with the continuous narrative, is displaying an identity crisis in this show. The tonal focus of that A storyline just didn't work. The humor was not on point. Characterizations were baffling to watch, really. And it just really worries me whenever we continue to go back to these more episodic elements of the series. So far, I will say She-Hulk feels rather inconsistent. Some parts of it really work, other parts just really don't, and these two halves don't mix well with one another. I'm fully invested into following this character and her story, but I just want the show to actually focus on this character and her story, to allow her to drive this narrative forward. But those are just my thoughts on episode 3 of She-Hulk Attorney at Law. I need to know what you thought of it in the comments below. Start the conversation, because that's the most important part. And thank you so much for joining me every week. If you are, if you're not, it's never too late to subscribe and join the conversation. Thank you so much for watching, and big thanks to my channel members for always supporting the channel. And until the next one, love each other and love the movies.